Hello and welcome to session 1.4 of Jesus and the Magic Money Tree. Growing, growing, gone. How well off can we get? Last time we asked the question, where does money come from? And these are some of the answers that emerged. The Bank of England was founded partly in order to make money for private lenders. Commercial banks create money out of thin air. Almost all the money in the economy exists because someone has gone into debt and is paying interest on it. With compound interest, the additional amount owed increases with every passing unit of time. Exponential growth. In this kind of system, the whole economy has to grow exponentially if one person's gain isn't to mean another's loss. And interest rates have never been this low since the Bank of England was founded. What does this tell us about our money system? Well, in this session, we'll be taking the story a stage further by looking at the idea of economic growth some more and asking what is it and what isn't it, and going on to ask what it really means to be well off. But let's start by getting a bit clearer about the idea that we've already come across, GDP. Which of these items would you say is not included in calculations of UK gross domestic product? Is it prostitution? Is it drug dealing? Is it parental childcare? Or is it holidays? The answer is parental childcare. Gross domestic product, or GDP, measures how much money changes hands when goods and services are bought and sold within a national economy during a specific period of time. Goods are things such as your new washing machine or the milk that you buy, and services include the haircut from your hairdresser or repairs done by your plumber. One way of measuring GDP is by adding together various national expenditures: personal spending, government spending, net exports, and net investment. Famously, GDP makes no distinction between different kinds of economic transactions. So the costs involved in building a school, say, are on exactly the same footing as prosecuting a war. They're valued equally. GDP really does show money acting as the general equivalent. Adding up the GDPs of all the countries in the world gives us gross world product, the size of the entire global economy. How much bigger is this now than it was in 1800, would you say? Is it twice as big? 10 times as big? 110 times? Or is it 10 million times? The answer is 110 times. And here's a picture that illustrates that. Gross world product is estimated to have been around about $1 trillion in 1800 at 2011 prices. It's now around 110 trillion. And of course, a trillion is a million billion, one with 12 zeros after it. That's equivalent to an average growth rate during that period of around about 2.2% per annum. What would you guess the average growth rate was before around 1800? Well, the answer is around about 0.01% per annum. In other words, for the vast majority of human history, the global economy, on the whole, has been static. Apart from short-lived, modest spurts here and there, significant levels of growth are a new thing. And since 1800, the average Briton has become 13 times better off than his or her ancestors. In 1800, British GDP per head was around about £2,300 at 2013 prices. It's now around 30,000. But this trend seems to be changing. Western Europe and the US enjoyed strong economic growth in the first 3 decades after World War II. But since the 1970s, growth rates have been slowing down. Despite a slight recovery in the 1990s, they're now lower than ever. For example, since 2000, the average UK annual growth rate has been barely 1%. This contrasts with an average rate of around 4% achieved across Western Europe during the heady days of Les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 post-war years. You may remember that back in session 1, we heard from Stephen D. King, the Group Chief Economist at HSBC, about his failed shopping trip in Jerusalem. This is him reflecting on this situation of stagnating growth, which is taken from his book, When the Money Runs Out, which you can find on the reading list. Western economies, he says, have slowed dramatically. At the beginning of the 21st century, the growth tap has turned off. Even before the financial crisis of 2007-8, Western economies were slowing. And yet, we need rapid growth to meet the promises we've made to ourselves. Through our pensions, our healthcare, our high levels of debt, our fast waning belief in financial alchemy, and our refusal to believe that this is anything other than a cyclical economic setback, we're persistently trying to consume tomorrow's income today. Today, people dip into the future without a care in the world. Without persistent economic expansion, however, their aspirations will go unmet. If King is right, what aspects of the Christian message might represent good news today? Can you think of any relevant Bible passages, perhaps? Take a moment to pause the presentation at this point to think about that. But here's one possible answer to those questions. Jesus feeding the big crowd. There's a lot to be gleaned from that well-known story, isn't there? But the ideas of giving thanks for what we do already have, genuinely valuing that, and sharing with everyone, surely those ideas are at the heart of that story. So if you haven't already, you might want to look that up afterwards. But does GDP really measure how well off we are anyway? The idea of GDP was initially developed in the US and the UK in the 30s and 40s, when the world was in the midst of major social and economic upheaval resulting from 2 global wars and the Great Depression. In the US, GDP was used to show that the country could afford to enter World War II without unduly jeopardizing the still recovering domestic economy. At the end of the war, the work done by the US and UK treasuries on GDP informed the famous Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, which established the post-war international economic order. That's how GDP came to be used by the IMF and the World Bank as the primary measure of economic progress over the ensuing years. One of those responsible for devising the idea of GDP was Nobel Prize winner Simon Kuznets. As long ago as 1934, Kuznets cautioned against equating increasing GDP with economic or social progress. He and his colleagues stressed that it was meant to be used as a specialized tool for measuring economic activity rather than economic well-being. Despite that, over the following 70 years, economic growth, measured as the annual increase in GDP, came to be taken for granted as the way of assessing economic health. So, how else could we measure how well off we are? Well, here's one possible measure, the Happy Planet Index, which seeks to measure how efficiently people are using natural resources to lead long and happy lives. This measure was originally developed by the New Economics Foundation in 2006, and it's just one of several alternatives to GDP to have emerged in recent decades. And these have been devised because it's become apparent that increasing per capita GDP doesn't necessarily reflect increasing well-being or progress. And here's the formula for the Happy Planet Index. As you can see, it's made up of 4 components. Well-being, which is how satisfied the residents of a particular country say they feel with life overall, as measured by the Gallup World Poll. Secondly, life expectancy, the average number of years a person is expected to live in a particular country. Thirdly, inequality of outcomes, the inequalities between people within a country in terms of how long they live, how happy they feel, based on the distribution in each country's life expectancy and well-being data. And finally, something called the Ecological Footprint, which we'll come back to in a few moments. But here's a quiz for you. Back in 2016, where were these countries in the Happy Planet Index league table, do you think? And in this league table, number 1 is top of the league, the happiest country, and 140 is absolutely rock bottom of the league, the least happy country. You might want to pause the presentation here, consider those 5 countries and think where in the league table each one of them featured. Well, the UK was at number 34. It's not too bad, is it? Top half of the table. Certainly better than the US, which was at a rather disappointing 108. Kenya, 83. Japan, 58. But top of the league, Costa Rica. So, does money buy happiness? Focusing now on the first component in that formula, looking at well-being. What do you get if you compare life satisfaction with GDP per capita? Well, what you get is this. It's a plot of life satisfaction against GDP per capita. Essentially, it's plotting how well off we feel against how well off we are financially speaking. As you can see, life satisfaction increases rapidly with per capita income up until you get to around about $10,000 per annum or so. After that, it starts to flatten off pretty quickly. And what that suggests is that you do need a basic level of financial affluence in order to enjoy a reasonable level of well-being. But beyond that, you're into the realm of diminishing returns. For example, according to this snapshot from 2005, people in the US were, on average, rather less content with their lot than those living in Brazil, Colombia, or Costa Rica, despite being on average 4 times as wealthy. You can find out more about the Gallup World Poll's Happiness Report in one of the handouts for this session, available from the Jesus and the Magic Money Tree web pages. Of course, you might be thinking that a subjective happiness index is just that, subjective. All kinds of cultural and historical factors might be at play here. Therefore, this isn't something which we should attach too much weight to. Well, maybe there's some truth in that. But here's a different measure with a more objective basis. On the horizontal axis, again, we have GDP per capita, this time in 2011 dollars. And on the vertical axis, we have something called the Human Development Index. That's a composite measure made up from life expectancy, average number of years of schooling, and GDP per capita. So it combines health, education, and economic measures into one. And again, there's more on the Human Development Index in the handout for this session. As you can see, it shows a similar kind of picture to the subjective well-being plot on the last slide that we looked at. Again, a steep increase until around about $20,000 per capita, according to a HDI of around about 0.7. And then the curve begins to flatten off pretty quickly. Can you see again there the law of diminishing returns showing itself? For example, although the average Norwegian is more than twice as wealthy as the average Israeli, she's no better off as measured by HDI. And you can play this game with many different measures of quality of life, and in case after case, what you get is the same general picture as illustrated here. Up to a point, there is genuine benefit accruing from increasing wealth as measured by GDP. But beyond a certain point, additional wealth simply goes into funding more extravagant lifestyles. Here's one final example. The Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI, is simply an adjusted version of GDP. It starts with personal consumer expenditure. You'll recall that that was a major component of GDP, but then adjusts that, subtracting costs associated with bad activities, such as crime and pollution, and adding contributions corresponding to good activities, components which are otherwise neglected in GDP, things like household work and ecosystem services. Obviously, how you cost each of these adjustments is arguable, so there exist a number of different GPI measures. But the value of GPI is less in any absolute measure it offers, but rather more in the qualitative contrast it provides with conventional GDP. And here are a couple of plots which illustrate that contrast. In this first one, we can see the change in global GDP and GPI per capita between 1947 and 2005. As you can see, GDP increases pretty uniformly during this period, but GPI grinds to a halt in the mid-1970s, and if anything, starts to decline after that. Here's the same data plotted in a different way, with GDP on the horizontal axis and GPI on the vertical axis. This reminds us somewhat, doesn't it, of the life satisfaction and the HDI plots which we looked at earlier, but in a more pronounced way. Again, this suggests that genuine progress is indeed associated with increases in GDP values for relatively low values of GDP. But beyond a certain point, that progress doesn't just stop, it starts going backwards. In a nutshell then, growing GDP and living well don't necessarily go hand in hand. Let's think a bit more about the consequences of not living well. For example, if everyone in the world consumed energy and materials at the rate that we do in the UK, how many planet Earths would it take to sustain this way of life? Is it a third of a planet? A single whole planet? Would it be 3 planets? Or would it be 30? Well, the answer is very roughly 3. 3 planet Earths we'd need if everybody in the world lived as we do here in the UK. This is known as the UK's ecological footprint. It measures how fast we consume resources and generate waste, compared to how fast nature can absorb our waste and generate new resources. Currently, the footprint of the whole human population is about 1.7 Earths. As a species, we've been living beyond our means since 1970. Unfortunately, increasing resource use and waste seem to go hand in hand with increasing GDP. So please, would you pause the presentation here again and have a look at Alex's video. He can explain a bit more about the ecological footprint and how it works. You can find out more about the ecological footprint on one of the session handouts. By now, I hope we've seen enough to make us question whether ever-growing GDP is necessarily a good thing. And that's true whether we consider how satisfied people are with their lives, or whether we consider the impact of human economic activity on the planet. An obvious and crucial question then suggests itself. Can we continue to have economic growth without that taking an increasing toll on our natural resources? So here are a couple of slides which look at trends in humanity's material footprint. That's to say, simply the amount of stuff we dig up and use each year. On the left-hand side of this first slide, we can see how between 1970 and 2013, the human race's material footprint trebled in size, from 28 billion to 84 billion tons per annum. On the right-hand side, you can see how that growth in material consumption closely mirrors GDP growth since 1990. Looking at the UK on its own between 1990 and 2010, you might be forgiven for thinking that it's a slightly rosier picture. GDP in blue increases fairly steadily during this period, and in red, DMC, or the domestic material consumption, which measures how much stuff we've directly consumed in the UK, declined pretty steadily. Good news, right? Well, it would be, except that DMC doesn't measure the total impact associated with the extraction, processing and transport of stuff imported into the UK from abroad. When you add in all these factors, you get the UK's material footprint in green. And it tells a very similar story to that in the previous slide, which considered global consumption. It rather looks like decoupling material consumption from GDP growth isn't possible. In other words, if we want to reduce our impact on the planet, which surely we do, then we need to be ready to say goodbye to economic growth. Time to pause and connect with the Bible now. Please look up this passage from Genesis and read it through a couple of times. Then have a think about these questions. Restart the presentation after you've done that. So, in this passage, Adam is presented as God's tenant farmer or steward, and the human calling by implication is therefore to cultivate and serve, to safeguard and preserve what is temporarily in our charge. Living well, or being well off, simply means living out this calling. Living badly means failing in this calling. The consequences of eating the forbidden fruit might be best seen, therefore, as the result of such failure. Well, we'll be returning to the question of economic growth and its link to the consumption of natural resources in part 2 of Jesus and the Magic Money Tree. But for now, as we come to the end of this session, What have we learned? Well, the GDP just measures the total amount of money changing hands in a country over a given period of time, for good or ill. The world economy is more than 100 times bigger now than it was in 1800. Before that, it hardly grew at all. We need strong GDP growth to honour the economic promises we've made to ourselves. And yet, since 2000, growth in developed Western nations has been paltry. Well-being requires a basic level of economic affluence, but stops increasing beyond that. Historically, increasing GDP has required increased resource use and waste, and that's not going to change soon. Join me again for the final session of part 1 of Jesus and the Magic Money Tree, when we'll be linking some of the strands uncovered during part 1, making connections with perspectives from the Bible and Christian tradition, and asking the basic question, faith in what?